This is Register 6 by Jay Wilburn. Kathy Abigail Hucks was a single mom when she returned to her old checkout job at the Red Bluff Market on Jeff Davis Road in Butler, South Carolina. This was not the path she had planned for herself when she packed up to go to college in another state. No, this path was a circle that brought her back to the place where she was born. Even her parents had left, one from death and the other in an old folks' home in another state. Kathy had a great aunt still in town who could watch little Tina so that she could work her shifts and use the money for rent, discounted groceries from the Red Bluff, and medicine when the girl got sick. That and not much else. That Sunday afternoon, she worked Register 6. A young boy had Register 4 and a young lady worked 2. There wasn't enough traffic with Kathy when Kathy clocked in to justify 3 registers, but the crowd leaving the beach on Sunday morning had just finished, and the girl would be off in another hour or so. This store was off the beaten path. Most beach traffic hit the Walmart and the Food Lions out on Oceanfront and Fuller Beach. This store served the Butler area and the locals who hated the tourists and their traffic. Out on this road, better stores and chains were just far enough away for people to put up with less selection and slightly higher prices. Truth was, Mr. Bluff had made a habit of adding in extras if more than a couple people asked for them. So the store had gone from just groceries to clothes to hunting gear to lawn equipment and more over the years that Kathy first worked there in her teens. Since the Finches took over the place, there had been a lot of changes. Since Kathy had come back and Cody Finch took over operations from his dad, things had changed a lot more. A wave of shoppers approached the 3 registers all at once. That seemed to be the way. They could stand there doing nothing for several minutes, and then everyone decided to check out at once like they heard some kind of dog whistle tuned to customers' ears. Mrs. Anders went to 2 with her meat and a few vegetables for the evening meal. Old Jack Thatcher had a few small items for Register 4. 3 different people came to Kathy's line. She held in a sigh and gave her widest smile to Horace Grogan, the first in her line. This was the way things worked, too. People would pile up on Kathy's register. You need to add that in. Because she was older. They had a natural aversion to teenagers. Some came because they remembered her from years before and they loved the familiar. Also, Kathy still had all the food codes memorized, so she didn't have to look them up. It was her punishment for being good at her job and too old for her job. As long as I'm changing things, I'll say and also. Looks like we're doing an edit more than a reading, so here we go. Horace didn't have a lot of items, but he frowned and shifted from foot to foot like he was in a hurry. This was a tricky situation. Kathy picked up the first item so it didn't appear she was holding him back. The first thing was a volume pack of duct tape and shrink wrap. "Find everything okay, Mr. Grogan?" He glanced around at the other registers and said, "Yes, fine, thanks." She had completed her greeting obligation and proceeded to ring him up quickly. The next 2 items were a plastic tarp and turpentine in the large canister. Kathy started to go under the counter for the larger bags, but Horace waved her off and said he'd carry out himself. She took his money and started to count out his change. "I know you can count, just give it to me and let me be on." She did, and he hauled out his goods with his head down. The next man had a skull mask on. At first, Kathy thought it was the protective hooding that bikers sometimes wore under their helmets to keep from breathing in dust and bugs. The guy wore leather all over, but this was more like the old pandemic mask people had to wear years back. This one had a leering skeleton grin across the face and highlighted accents in deep blue that matched the shaggy-haired man's eyes. Kathy swallowed. "Doing well today?" He nodded, but that was it. She looked away and rung him up. This man was buying matchbooks, 120 of them by her quick count, 27 bottles of cough medicine, a hacksaw, a candy bar from the impulse buy shelf next to the register. She looked up at the fellow over his skeleton mask. There were rules about buying large quantities of cough syrup, and the matchbooks were a red flag too. However, Cody Finch, the new boss, had a policy of not questioning any purchases. He didn't care if they were cooking meth or burning their garage down around themselves. He'd rather sell all the cough syrup than to let it sit on shelves and go bad. Sell it and don't question it. One of her biggest fears was that Tina's daddy might show back up. He was the type to buy cold and allergy medicines in quantity for repurposing. If God was good, that mistake of a man was long dead. She doubted God could be so kind as to solve that problem for her, though, so that shadow hung over her life daily. Kathy bagged everything up. The guy left exact change on the metal counter right down to the penny, including the tax. He took his bags and made for the exit. The boy and girl in the other registers leaned and talked to one another. Neither had bothered to call over the third customer waiting. So Kathy swallowed down the bitter taste in her mouth and smiled up at a man who had to be 7 feet tall. She didn't even know they made overalls that big. It looked like his pair were well worn, so maybe that size was hard to find. She greeted him and expected a deep voice like the butler on that old Addams Family show. He had kind of a high, squeaky voice, though. Kathy bit down on the inside of her cheeks to keep from laughing. He was friendly, at least. She rang up his items: edible glitter, a Chia Pet multi-pack, an inflatable elephant in its tight sealed package, a dozen bottles of baby oil, 2 bottles of cheap champagne, and a glow-in-the-dark lizard eye bowling ball. God, they sold some weird stuff. It was a wonder they still had room on the shelves for food, even with the expansion. She carded the giant for the cheap champagne. There were rules about selling it on Sundays in Rutledge County, but Mr. Cody Finch insisted that he had an exception, and it wasn't her business. Just sell what they wanted. This guy was 23, but looked to be in his late 50s. His eyes were yellow in his license and in real life. He might ought to hold back on the cheap champagne for the sake of his liver. After he left, Kathy wished she had paid attention to his name, but not for long, because another wave of customers came all at once. The canned Muzak version of Tracy Chapman's Fast Cars started playing over the recessed speakers in the ceiling. This was her least favorite part of the music loop that repeated a dozen times a shift. This song made her sad. It made her afraid for her daughter's future, a worry that boiled under the surface of her mind all the time anyway. Leave tonight or live and die this way, Kathy thought. No kidding, Tracy. Like before, several customers lined up at her register. The kids went on leaning. She was about to say something, but then a couple carts loaded with groceries got the other registers into action. Kathy figured she had the better deal, with people mostly carrying plastic baskets. Marvin Yates unloaded first. His conversation matched the terse exchange with Mr. Grogan earlier. As she prepared to ring him up, he leaned in and asked in a low voice, "Was that old bastard Horace in here earlier?" That froze Kathy in her otherwise fluid process. There was something dark in that tone in the tone of that question. Horace Grogan? That's the one. Was he here? Kathy said yes before she considered she might want to stay out of it. Marvin leaned in closer. She could smell his old man aftershave that stunk like a cleaning product. He whispered even lower, "What did he buy?" Jesus, maybe it was his mouthwash. That stuff was mostly alcohol and a coating of mint. Tina's daddy dug into that stuff when he was desperate and had already spent all their money. Kathy licked her lips. If she had room to back up a step without knocking over her stool, she would have. This was one positive of the Finches taking over. They provided stools for the registers because they didn't care if you sat down between ringing folks up. She said, "I don't remember. There've been a lot of people through today." Marvin looked around the store as if to challenge that excuse. He eyed her like he knew she was lying. Finally, he said, "Doesn't matter none. Just don't tell him what I bought." Kathy nodded and started ringing items up. Why and how would she tell Horace Grogan anything? He had already been through the store. It wasn't like he was making multiple trips. Marvin Yates bought bleach, tarps of his own, rope, 2 lengths of chain in 2 different widths, a large plastic tub, a hammer, and a medium-sized pickaxe. She gave him the total and asked in a soft voice, "Do you want me to bag this up?" He paid her and started throwing everything into the big tub. Just forget you saw me. She handed him his change without a word. He threw it all into the tub too and walked out. Kathy felt cold inside as she looked at another skeleton mask over a bald man's mouth and nose. This one was highlighted in green, but the tall man with brown eyes and a diagonal scar across his but the tall man had brown eyes and a diagonal scar across his forehead. He was taller than the blue skeleton, but much shorter than the giant with edible glitter and yellow eyes. Seeing a lot of mass today, she said. The fellow narrowed his eyes. How many? She shook her head. Just one other. He tilted his head as he stared down at her. One other is not a lot. Maybe if I'm not used to seeing any, it is. She saw his jaw working below the mask and decided just to run his items and get him out of here. He bought 7 frog eye masks, a taco sleeping bag, a skin-tight anatomy bodysuit, and 19 plastic lawn flamingos. He used a credit card and ID with the name John Smith and a full head of hair in the picture. She absently told him to have a nice day and rang the next customer wearing sunglasses and a broad hat low over his ears. Before she could greet him, he turned his back on her. He bought a tissue holder in the shape of a cat's butt, 3 cases of hot mustard-flavored soda, coyote urine, and 5 miniature rakes. The guy gave her 2 20s and left without his change. Kathy took the change out of her register and set it aside as she would get in trouble if the register was off. The next lull was not long enough, and there was Horace Grogan again, just like Marvin Yates feared. Did you forget something, Mr. Grogan? His eyes darted from side to side. Was Marvin Yates in here? Okay, that needs to be a question mark. I guess it's a good thing that I'm reading this because I had a lot of mistakes. All right. She sighed and said, might have been. He could have gone through a different register. Did he go through a different register? Heat rose up in her cheeks. I don't know. If he does come through, would you call me? Would you give me a call? Kathy swallowed 3 times before she said, no, sir, can't do that. Can't or won't. When she didn't answer right away, he leaned in. She backed up, scooting her stool out into the aisle for the chained and closed register 7. Are you on his side? She exhaled slowly and said, I don't know what you two have going on, but it's none of my business, so I'm on my side, and my side is out of it. Horace blinked and took a step back. Damn, girl, you could just say no. You didn't have to make a whole hysterical production out of it. She clenched her teeth and said, will this be all? It's all I can carry, so it'll have to be, he said, he said it with that sort of old man one-liner southern charm that grew old on Kathy years and years ago. She started ringing him up. This time he had a large sports duffel bag. By store policy, she had to unzip all the pockets to check for hidden items. Horace crossed his arms as he waited, but didn't say anything. As she rang up the rest of it, he loaded the smaller items that would fit into the bag. He bought an animal prod, like the electrical things they used on cows, but smaller. She didn't know they carried anything like that, but the register recognized it, and she kept going. He also purchased meat shredding claws, dozens of padlocks, a muzzle, a dog harness, a large animal cage, and a ball gag. He snatched the gag from her hand as she stared at the register, still not believing it had rung up. Horace paid, took his change, and strolled out for the second time that day with a heavy bag on one side and a cage on the other. I have a business degree, she thought. I should be able to do something with that if I could ever get my feet under me. The next person in line had a yellow skeleton mask. He bought one of every candy sold by the register. The guy pointed after Horace and said, does anyone just buy groceries anymore? She handed him the heavy bag of candy and said, I'm starting to wonder. The next man in line was Marvin Yates again. He said, don't try to deny it. I saw Horace with all that crazy stuff. I waited until I saw his truck pull away to get in line. Kathy just stared without comment. Now, I want you to tell me the truth. Was he by himself, or were there other folks with him? You said you saw him, she countered. I don't have time for you to be cute. Just answer my question and then ring me up. She sighed and said, I'm telling you the same thing I told him. This is none of my business, and I'm not getting dragged into whatever weirdness you two got going on. I'm not involved. Marvin did not back down as quickly as Horace had. He pointed in her face and said, "I'll tell you this. If I find out you told him anything about what I was doing here, you better believe that she slapped his liver-spotted hand aside. The kids at the other registers turned to watch as they paused from ringing up perfectly normal grocery orders from regular customers. "What the hell?" Marvin squeaked like he was out of breath. "If you have a problem with me or one of the other customers or whatever else, Mr. Yates, you can take it up with the Finches. If you want them involved in whatever business you got going on, then feel free." Marvin did recoil a bit. It was kind of a dirty trick on her part. The Finches had a long-running reputation for being a Southern crime family. As with most tales, they grew bigger, deadlier, and bloodier with the years and repeated tellings. At the very least, it shut Marvin Yates up. That got her mind onto her great aunt. Tina came home with all sorts of fantastic and often scary tales about Rutledge County. Some versions of those stories Kathy had heard in her own youth. Others were strange, new, and convoluted, and had her wishing she could afford proper child care. Aunt Trixie might be slipping a little with age. Marvin waved impatiently at his items like she was holding him up. She rang him up without paying too much attention to the connotations. She bagged up his plastic tubing, jars of Vaseline, canisters of kerosene, a dozen bandanas, empty mason jars, and a pair of trigger gas lighters. He hefted his bags in one strained hand and marched out the door. A guy wearing a motorcycle helmet with the face shield down put a bag of dog biscuits, a Bible in plastic, a stack of zombie movie DVDs, and a bottle of fish tank antibiotics on the counter. She was about to greet the fellow when something exploded outside. She turned in time to see a fireball mushroom up past the windows. Kathy couldn't tell how far away the blast was, but all the shelves in the store shook. She spied Marvin Yates just outside the doors with his bags from his most recent purchases scattered on the ground. He was squeezing a canister of burning fluid out into the parking lot. Kathy tried to remember where she had parked. She couldn't afford another car. The shovel blade swung into view and caught Marvin square in the face. Horace Grogan stepped into her line of sight over Marvin on the ground. He lifted the shovel over his head, and for one crazy moment, all Kathy could think was whether Horace had bought that shovel here or not. She couldn't remember. A man in an orange skeleton mask pulled the shovel out of Horace's hand. Horace didn't miss a beat as he fell on Marvin and started choking him. The boy and girl at the other registers lifted their phones and started recording. The dude in the helmet left his items and ran back through the store. Kathy called out, "Could one of you call the police while the other films it for TikTok or whatever?" An older woman lined up at Register 4 took out her phone and made the call. Several men in skeleton masks pulled Horace off of Marvin. Then they dragged Marvin up to his feet and away too. It was only then that the scrawny manager who Cody Finch had hired came running out to ask what happened. Kathy just shook her head. Sirens sounded and a fire truck arrived to put out a building across the street that Kathy couldn't remember what it used to be years ago. Today it was a bonfire. The manager had Kathy and the other two finish ringing people up. She never saw the guy in the helmet again, so had to reshelve his stuff between customers. Eventually the manager came out and said Mr. Finch decided to close for the day, but they would be paid through the end of the shift. They would be called that night for tomorrow's hours. Police were on the scene as Kathy drove away, but didn't ask any questions about what happened. As she drove to pick up Tina, she tried to put another bad shift behind her.